Okay, because last time I did this, I felt like it froze a bit too much. I thought I'd pre-record it this time. So I'm going to read and annotate the second chapter of Jekyll and Hyde. I'm going to do it in one take. So if I mess up, no editing, I'm just going to carry on. So let's see how we go. Let's read the second chapter. So the second chapter is the search for Mr. Hyde. So clearly, the last chapter ended with a kind of promise that they'd never talk about that story ever again. But here, they're on a search for him. So we're looking for Mr. Hyde. So a clue probably that we're going to possibly find him in this chapter. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house. So he's a bachelor, remember? So he is a single man. House in somber spirits and sat down to dinner without relish. So he can't eat. Okay, he hasn't got any. It hasn't. It isn't that he literally hasn't got any relish. It's that he hasn't got any relish-like energy to eat it. It was his custom of a Sunday, when his meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk. Dry divinity. So he's reading some kind of holy text. Divinity meaning holy, on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighbouring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. So quite a lonely existence he's got, isn't it? He just has his meal by himself, he reads a dry book, then he goes to bed. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will. So we get the first mention of Dr. Jekyll and his will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. The will was holograph, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. So he's had this will from Jekyll, but he's refused to make it. He's given it the least assistance. It provided not only that, in case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, MD, DCL, LLD, FRS, so Jekyll, the MD of course means he's a doctor, he's got lots of different kind of qualifications. All his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor. Now, a benefactor is someone who would benefit from someone when they kind of die, Edward Hyde. So the will says that if Jekyll dies, everything goes to Edward Hyde. But in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay, and free from any burden or obligation, beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. So interestingly here it says that if he was to go missing, if there's an unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 months, then it doesn't matter if Jekyll's not dead, Hyde would still sort of benefit from this will. This document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. So this has been on Utterson's mind for quite a long time. It's just been an eyesore, something he wanted to deal with. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life. Interesting description of Utterson there. This bit, he is a lawyer obviously, but he's a lover of the sane and customary sides of life. So he really likes the rational side of life, like logical things that can be explained. To whom the fanciful was the immodest, and hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was more when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes. Detestable, again, these detestable qualities given to Hyde, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mist that had so long baffled his eye, there leaped up the sudden, definite presentment of a fiend. And a fiend is a devil, okay? A fiend is a devil. And so this is something that Utterson's been worrying about. The will in his safe has obviously had this name on it, but before Enfield's story, he didn't know just how kind of devilish and monstrous and detestable Hyde actually was. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe. Even the will has become obnoxious, just like Hyde perhaps. And now I begin to fear it is disgrace. So he's really fearing for Jekyll's reputation and the fact that perhaps it's in disgrace. which is kind of the worst thing that can happen in Victorian society. So he's really worried about Jekyll. With that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine. So this is like the capital for medicine. So of sort of medical science and kind of scientific thought. Where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, so we're going to meet a new character here, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. So he wants truth, and he wants it from Lanyon. So he thinks Lanyon can give it to him. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but ushered direct from the door to the dining room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine, another character who is alone, living by himself. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman. So we get from this, don't we, this list, hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced, that he's quite a kind person, full of life. With a shock of hair prematurely white. So he's got one bit of hair that's kind of gone white before the rest, and a boisterous and decided manner. At sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. So he's really welcoming. The geniality, so that's kind of like his friendliness, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. So he's quite a genuine guy, Lanyon. For these two were old friends. So Utterson and Lanyon are old friends, old mates both at school and college. So they're even old mates, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other, and what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. So unlike Utterson with Enfield, he kind of, like each other's silent company, these two have a more kind of friendly relationship as we would kind of see it in sort of modern day. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. "I suppose, Lanyon," said he, "you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has." So we now learn that actually Utterson too and Lanyon are the oldest friends of Henry Jekyll. We get his first name, by the way, Henry Jekyll. "I wish the friends were younger," chuckled Dr. Lanyon, "but I suppose we are. And what of that? I see little of him now." So he doesn't really see him anymore, Lanyon. "Indeed," said Utterson, "I thought you had a bond of common interest." So he thought they were friends. "We had," was the reply, "but it is more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me." So 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, they had a kind of falling out. "He began to go wrong." So he thinks that he's gone wrong in mind. And though of course I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash. And balderdash just means nonsense, okay? Such unscientific nonsense, added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple. Would have estranged Damon and Pythias. Now we don't have to worry about Damon and Pythias. It's quite an obscure reference. This little spurt of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They had only differed on some point of science, he thought. So the only argument they'd had, it's okay, they just argued about science, I can live with that. And being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, "It is nothing worse than that." He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure, and then approached the question he had come to put. "Did you ever come across a protégé?" And protégé just means a kind of like, it's almost like an apprentice of his. "One Hyde?" he asked. So he's going to ask Lanyon about Hyde. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, never heard of him since my time." So Lanyon doesn't seem to know who Hyde is, so he doesn't know Hyde. That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind. So he can't sleep, he's having kind of nightmares. His mind is toiling, which means working. Toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. So all these questions, this curiosity has been kind of fueled in him. He can't let it go. He wants to know more about Hyde and about Jekyll. In many ways, Utterson's going to be a bit like a detective for us, where he kind of is solving the crime. Now, of course, he's not literally a detective, but he plays that kind of role in the story. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto, it had touched him on the intellectual side alone. So before, he just thought about it intellectually, which means kind of rationally, with his brain. But now his imagination also was engaged, or rather enslaved. And as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night in the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. So he's having kind of like flashbacks to Enfield's story from chapter 1. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctor's, and then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. So he's remembering that little girl, getting trampled from chapter 1. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling at his dreams, and then the door of that room would be opened, the curtains of the beds plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even at that dead hour he must rise and do its bidding. So he has, in his dreams he's having flashbacks, but he's also thinking perhaps of Jekyll asleep in his rich house, dreaming and smiling at his dreams, but there's some kind of figure that's waiting to do its bidding. So he's having this odd dream. It's quite interesting to note this odd dream about Jekyll. So he's dreaming about both Hyde and Jekyll, like Hyde when he ran over the girl, but then Jekyll as well in his house. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. So he's imagining now that he's not just doing it to one girl, but he's doing it all over London, this Hyde figure. And London is like this labyrinth, it's like this sort of maze of kind of where these dark things are happening at night, and he's dreaming about what things Hyde might be getting up to. Just like John McCrae said in the Massa lecture we watched, obviously a lot of the things Hyde's going to do in this are unspeakable crimes, but this we do have, we know that he trampled over this girl, but I think he's getting at that he might be doing even more than that, at night. And still the figure had no face by which he might know it, so he can't put a face to Hyde. Even in his dreams it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes. And thus it was that there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. So he has this curiosity to see Mr. Hyde for himself. He wants to see evil for himself and put a face to evil. He wants to know. If he could but once set eyes on him, he thought, the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. So he thinks he can get rid of the nightmares if he finally sees his face. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, call it which he please, and even for the startling clauses of the will. So he's hoping this might rationalise the mystery of the will. If he just sees his face, maybe it would give him some answers. And at least it would be a face worth seeing. The face of a man who was without bowels of mercy. So he's saying that Hyde, this is talking about Hyde has no mercy. No mercy with him. Mercy, by the way, is a very kind of Christian trait. And he's saying that this Hyde figure doesn't have any. A face which had but to show itself to raise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield a spirit of enduring hatred. So Enfield, someone who doesn't really have any impressions about people, he has this spirit of enduring hatred. He absolutely hates even he hated Hyde. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. So he's haunting it. He's now staying by that door. He's so curious. He can't do anything but stay by the door. In the morning before office hours, at noon, when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. We get here. This is a really clear sort of play on words, isn't it? And it does show you that Stevenson has a sense of humour. It very much, this is a pun, isn't it? Hide and seek. And at last, his patience was rewarded. It was a fine dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary, so it's really, there's no one around, it's solitary. And in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. So it's silent, it's solitary. Small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd, light footstep drawing near. So the footsteps are odd and light. Even his footsteps sound weird. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested. So these footsteps have had a bigger impact on him than any footsteps before. And it was with a strong superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer, and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed. Okay, so this is clearly going to be Hyde. We get him by his height, don't we? This is Hyde. And the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. So even seeing him from far away is something you don't want to see. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came, he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home. So it feels like this is Hyde's home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. So they meet, finally. Mr. Hyde, I think. Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. He hisses, almost like a snake. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough. That's my name. What do you want? I see you are going in, returned the lawyer. I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me. You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is from home, replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key, and then suddenly, but still without looking up, How did you know me? He asked. On your side, said Mr. Utterson. Will you do me a favour? With pleasure, replied the other. What shall it be? Will you let me see your face? So there's the real motive for him being here. You know, Utterson's motive is to see this face, to see evil properly. Now, obviously, they've had this quite strange exchange here, quite formal, quite awkward. I just want to say that he answers quite coolly again. Whenever Hyde speaks, he's quite cool in his in his kind of the way he talks. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance. So suddenly he grows this air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds, so they're sort of squaring up to each other. Now I shall know you again, said Mr. Utterson. It may be useful. Yes, returned Mr. Hyde. It is as well we have met, and apropos, you should have my address. And he gave a number of a street in Soho. Good God, thought Mr. Utterson. Can he too have been thinking of the will? But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgment of the address. So we get Utterson's thoughts here. He's shocked by this address in Soho. Seems to link to this will. And now, said the other, how did you know me? By description, was the reply. Whose description? We have common friends, said Mr. Utterson. So he says how we have common friends. Common friends, echoed Mr. Hyde, a little hoarsely. Notice this adverb here, hoarsely. Often Stevenson's going to use these adverbs to explain how Hyde is speaking or moving. It's going to tell us a bit about him, and they're always quite negative, quite sinister, quite confrontational. Who are they? Jekyll, for instance, said the lawyer. So Utterson, no, he's really kind of, he wants to know more about the connection between Hyde and Jekyll. So he's been quite risky here. He's like bringing up, he takes a risk. He says, "Oh, Jekyll told me who you were." "He never told you," cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. And he gets suddenly really angry, quite intense, just at the mention of that. He thinks he's lying, doesn't he? "I did not think you would have lied." "Come," said Mr. Utterson, "that is not fitting language." So Utterson, is a man of Victorian sort of respectability, and Hyde is sort of breaking the rules. It's Utterson believes in decorum, and by decorum I mean kind of being polite, being well-mannered. The other snarled, so he snarls aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, so really, really fast, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. So Hyde vanishes very, very quickly. I think this bit's really interesting. He snarls aloud, a bit like an animal, really, isn't it? And the way he hissed earlier as well. And actually, this technique, you could say that snarling aloud is it's zoomorphism. And zoomorphism is when we turn a character into kind of like an animal, okay? So the zoo just means animal, and morph means change, yeah? So changing them into animal. The snarl, the hiss, both of them kind of do that. I think as well the savage laugh, it sort of links back for me to like cavemen. There's something primitive about Mr. Hyde, like early man or something. The lawyer stood a while where Mr. Hyde had left him. The picture of disquietude, so he's really confused by what he's just seen. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow like a man in mental perplexity, so he's really confused by what he's just seen. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of a class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture, some lovely alliteration there, murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. So he's kind of this, he's like a contrast of being really timid, really shy, and also very bold, very sort of brave. And he spoke with a husky whispering, so very husky and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing and fear, good quote here again, disgust, loathing and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. So look, he looked weird, he was kind of rude, there was all this kind of stuff about him, but there was something else that created in him this disgust, this hatred, loathing and this fear. There must be something else, said the perplexed gentleman. There is something more. I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. So again, we've got kind of that alliteration to describe how he's not really human. Constant comparisons made to Hyde here, aren't there? About how he's like an animal, he's inhuman, he's kind of deformed. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Now, a troglodyte is like an early form of man, like a caveman. So troglodytic, quite a good word to know for context there. He's like a troglodyte, he's like something like a caveman. Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think, for oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll. So Harry, by the way, is because he's friends with him. Henry's his formal name, but Harry, I guess, is his sort of like informal name. If ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, lovely little quote there. It's a lovely sort of metaphor, isn't it? It is on that of your new friend. So Satan's signature is written all over Hyde's face. So religious imagery there as well. Round the corner from the by-street there was a square of ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate, and let in flats and chambers to all sorts and conditions of mere map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied entire. And at the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. So he turned up at a house of wealth and comfort. I think we can guess whose house this might be. A well-dressed, elderly servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Paul?" asked the lawyer. So he's knocking on Jekyll. And Paul is his butler. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," said Paul, admitting the visitor, as he spoke into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall, paved with flags, warmed, after the fashion of a country house, by a bright open fire, and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. So it's a lovely, warm, like country house, isn't it? This lovely house that Jekyll lives in. Very different to the door we saw in chapter 1. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on to the tall fender. This hall in which he was now left alone was a pet fancy of his friend the doctor's, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. So, pleasantest room in London, that is a superlative. It's not just pleasant, it is the pleasantest room in London. But tonight, superlative. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood, so something's making him feel uneasy. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory. He felt, what was rare with him, a nausea and distaste of life. So he feels sick. He's got a distaste for life. And in the gloom of his spirits, almost like a depression, he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets and the uneasy starting of the shadow on the roof. He was ashamed of his relief. Again, he was ashamed earlier, wasn't he, of his relief? Earlier when, no, he wasn't. That's from the quiz. He was ashamed of his relief when Paul presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll was gone out. So just to explain this a bit, he's like ashamed of himself for, for what he's starting to think about Hyde. About Hyde. He's like ashamed of, I'm starting to think so much about Hyde that he's up to no good. I'm ashamed of that. "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room door, Paul," he said. "Is that quite right, when Dr. Jekyll is from home?" "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key, so we now learn that this door..." So we need to get the geography right here. The weird door on the street goes into the old dissecting room, which is like an old surgeon's room, okay? Where surgeons would dissect kind of bodies in autopsies and experiments. And Hyde actually has a key to that. And actually, if you kept going along the house, you would get to this lovely front that Utterson's just entered by into Jekyll's house. So there are two sort of sides to the house. You've got Jekyll's lovely part of the side of the house, and there's then this dissecting room that Hyde sort of seems to go in and out of. It's important to get that geography quite right, and that's quite a reveal at this point that it's the same house. The door on the street and Jekyll's actually belong to the same property. "Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Paul," resumed the other musingly. "Yes, sir, he do indeed," said Paul. "We have all orders to obey him, so they've all been ordered to obey him no matter what he says." "I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde," asked Utterson. "Oh dear no, sir, he never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory. Well, good night, Paul. Good night, Mr. Utterson." And the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. So he's a bit upset about this realization. Poor Harry Jekyll, he thought. My mind misgives me. He is in deep waters, so he worries he's in trouble. He was wild when he was young. Lovely little quote here about Jekyll. There was something wild in Jekyll when he was a young man. And we don't really know why. Did he drink? Did he have some crazy ideas? Did he sleep with too many women? Was he secretly gay? We don't know. But he was wild when he was young. A long while ago, to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations. It must be that. The ghost of some old sin. So he thinks it's something that he's done in the past. The cancer of some concealed disgrace. Punishment coming, pediclordo, years after memory has forgotten, and self-love condone the fault. So he thinks that this must be, Hyde must have something on him, something he's done, some old sin, some concealed disgrace. And that's going to be concealing is a really important idea in this book as well. And the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all corners of memory, lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity should leap to light there. His past was fairly blameless, so Utterson actually didn't really get up to much mischief when he was younger. Few men could read the rolls of their life with little apprehension, yet he was humbled to the dust by the many little things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many that he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. So Utterson nearly did some bad things, but he avoided them. And then by a return on his former subject, he conceived a spark of hope. This Master Hyde, if he were studied, now remember this is the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, thought he, last paragraph, thought he, must have secrets of his own, black secrets. So Hyde must have secrets too, by the look of him. Secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. Lovely simile there to sort of say, look, Jekyll might have done some bad in the past, but whatever Hyde is doing is much, much worse. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, what awakening. So he feels like he's calling him a creature again. He's not a man, he's a creature, Hyde, and he's stealing like a thief. And the danger of it, for this Hyde suspects the existence of the will. He may grow impatient to inherit. So he's saying that if Hyde realizes about this will, Hyde might kill Jekyll early for inheritance from the will. I must put my shoulder to the wheel. If Jekyll will but let me, he added. If Jekyll will only let me. So he's hoping that Jekyll will help him kind of get to the bottom of this will. For once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clear as a transparency, the strange clauses of the will. So this chapter ends with this image again of it began with the will, it's going to end with the will. So we get some kind of circular structure on this chapter. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. I'm now going to return you to live Mr. Owen.